It's been 3 months since that night, but even now my chest tightens whenever I think about it. Writing this feels like poking at an old wound, but I need to share it. Maybe it's a warning. Maybe it's therapy. Or maybe it's just me trying to make sense of what happened. It was a Friday evening. The kind of day that weighs on you, leaving you drained before the weekend even begins. Work had been relentless, the usual chaos of meetings and deadlines taking their toll. By the time I got home, I was a shadow of myself, worn and restless. All I wanted was an escape, something to shake off the monotony of the week. That's when I thought of Carl's parties. Carl was the kind of friend who had secrets, big ones. He didn't talk about them much, but those who knew, knew. His swing parties weren't just any social gathering. They were the kind of event where boundaries blurred and inhibitions dissolved. I'd been to a few before, enough to know the drill. Carl himself never participated. He just organized, collected the small entry fee, and made sure the rules were clear. It was his way of staying out of the mess while keeping everyone else happy. I didn't bother calling anyone to join me that night. I wasn't in the mood to make plans or play hostess to a friend's nerves. It felt like a solo mission, a chance to indulge in my own way without worrying about someone else's experience. I threw on a sleek black dress, something simple but flattering, and left the house with only one thought: to let go. The party was in its usual spot, a quiet 2-story house in a neighborhood where no one asked questions. The outside looked ordinary, but the moment I stepped inside I felt the shift. The warm glow of low lights bathed the room, and soft music played just beneath the hum of conversation. Familiar faces greeted me with easy smiles, but there were others I didn't recognize. Strangers. Their eyes lingered a little too long, their laughter too sharp, like they were trying to belong but didn't quite know how. I didn't pay it much mind. I grabbed a glass of wine and wove through the small crowd, catching snippets of laughter and whispered conversations. It was comforting in a way. A familiar dance of coy glances, flirtatious smiles, and the electric hum of possibility. But as the night wore on, the air grew heavier. There was an energy in the room, subtle but undeniable, like a storm brewing in the distance. It wasn't the usual buzz of excitement. Felt different, uneasy. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just imagining things. After all, I'd been here before. I knew how these nights went. At one point, I found myself leaning against the kitchen counter, swirling my drink absent-mindedly. The crowd had grown. The room felt warmer, almost stifling, and the music seemed louder than before. My head buzzed, not from the alcohol but from the atmosphere. It was intoxicating in its own way, a pull that I couldn't quite resist. And then there was a moment, a fleeting one, but it stayed with me. A man I didn't recognize stood nearby, his back to me. He wasn't speaking, just watching the room with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Something about him felt out of place, not in the way he looked or dressed, but in the way he carried himself. Like he was there for something specific, something deliberate. When he turned, our eyes met, and I felt a jolt of unease. His smile was slow, too slow, and his gaze lingered a fraction longer than I was comfortable with. I quickly looked away, pretending to focus on my drink. I told myself to relax, to stop overthinking. These parties were supposed to be an escape, a way to unwind. And yet, that tension in my chest refused to ease. Something felt wrong, even if I couldn't put my finger on it. By the time the clock struck midnight, the house was packed. The usual intimate feel of the party was gone, replaced by a chaotic energy that made it hard to think. Bodies brushed past me, laughter echoed louder than it should have, and the wine in my glass tasted bitter. My limbs felt heavy, my thoughts sluggish, like I was swimming through molasses. I didn't understand it then, but in hindsight, I know that was the moment everything began to unravel. I remember standing in the living room, trying to steady myself. My pulse quickened, and my vision blurred at the edges. Someone asked if I was okay, their voice distant and muffled, but I couldn't respond. I felt myself tipping forward, the world spinning around me, and then nothing. When I came to, everything was different. When I woke, the world felt muted, like I was underwater. The dim lighting in the room made everything feel surreal, and for a moment I didn't know where I was. My body was heavy, each movement sluggish, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The familiar warmth of Carl's house surrounded me, but it felt different now, emptier, quieter. I was lying on one of the oversized leather couches, my legs tucked beneath me. The soft fabric of my dress clung to my skin, damp with sweat. A faint hum of music drifted through the walls, but it felt distant, as though it was coming from another world. Carl's voice broke through the fog. "Lisa, you scared the hell out of me." He was crouched in front of me, his expression tight with concern. His hands hovered near my shoulder, hesitant, as if he didn't know whether to touch me or let me be. "What happened?" My voice came out in a whisper, raspy and dry. I struggled to sit up, the movement making my head throb. "You fainted," Carl said, his brows furrowed. "One minute you were fine and the next, I found you on the floor. I had to get everyone to back off. You've been out for a while." "Out?" I echoed, trying to make sense of his words. My memories were a blur. Flashes of faces, laughter, and that strange man's lingering gaze. But everything beyond that was a haze. I looked down at myself and noticed faint smudges on my skin, like someone had brushed against me. My dress was slightly askew, my hair a mess. I felt exposed in a way I couldn't explain. Carl handed me a glass of water. His hands were steady, but there was a nervous energy in the way he looked at me. "Drink," he said softly. "You need it." I sipped the water, the coolness soothing my parched throat. "Did anyone?" My words trailed off. I didn't know how to finish the sentence, didn't know what I was even asking. Carl shook his head quickly, almost too quickly. "I don't think so," he said, his voice tight. "I got to you before anything could happen." "But Lisa," he hesitated, his eyes scanning my face. "There were a lot of people here tonight. Too many. Some of them I didn't even recognize." His words sent a chill through me. Carl's parties were usually intimate. Familiar faces, a few strangers who blended in easily. But tonight had been different. Larger. Louder. And now, the emptiness of the house felt stark in contrast. "I want to go home," I said, setting the glass down. My hands trembled slightly, betraying the calm I was trying to project. Carl nodded, helping me to my feet. His touch was firm but gentle, grounding me as I wobbled. My legs felt like jelly, every step a struggle. The walk to his car was silent, the cool night air biting against my skin and making me shiver. As we drove, I stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and white. My thoughts raced, each one more unsettling than the last. I replayed the night in my mind, trying to piece together what I could remember. The heat of the room, the taste of the wine, the stranger's smiles. That man's gaze. When we reached my apartment, Carl walked me to the door. His hand rested lightly on my back, a comforting gesture that felt out of place considering the circumstances. "Call me if you need anything," he said, his tone serious. "And Lisa, maybe think about taking a break from these parties. Just for a while." I nodded, too tired to argue. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, my breath coming in shaky gasps. The silence of my apartment was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos I had just left. In the shower, I scrubbed my skin raw, the hot water cascading over me as I tried to wash away the unease clinging to me. But no matter how hard I scrubbed, I couldn't shake the feeling of hands brushing against me, of eyes watching me. As I crawled into bed that night, the ache in my body was a constant reminder of the evening. But it wasn't just physical. There was something deeper, an invisible weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but the images wouldn't stop. Flickering lights, blurred faces, and that overwhelming sense of being out of control. I didn't know it then, but this was only the beginning. I didn't leave my apartment the next day. Instead, I wrapped myself in a blanket, replaying fragments of the previous night in my head. The ache in my body lingered, subtle yet persistent, like a quiet reminder that something had gone wrong. I spent most of the day avoiding my reflection, avoiding my phone, avoiding anything that might force me to confront what had happened. It wasn't until late afternoon that my phone buzzed. A message from Carl. "Lisa, I need to talk to you. Let me know when you're ready." I stared at the words, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to ignore him, to bury everything and pretend it hadn't happened. But another part, the part that couldn't shake the unease lodged deep in my chest, knew I needed answers. I typed back a quick response. "Come over." It didn't take long for Carl to show up. He was always punctual, a habit I used to tease him about. When I opened the door, his face was serious. His usual easy smile replaced with a tension that made my stomach knot. "Lisa," he said as he stepped inside. His voice low and cautious. "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," I lied. The truth was, I felt like I was unraveling, but I wasn't ready to say it out loud. I motioned for him to sit on the couch, and we settled into an uneasy silence before he finally spoke. "I've been going over last night in my head," he began, running a hand through his hair. "There were too many people. A lot of them I didn't know, and I'm usually good about keeping track of who comes in. But this time," he trailed off, his eyes meeting mine. Something felt off. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I focused on the way his words seemed to mirror my own feelings. "Do you think," I hesitated, the question catching in my throat, "do you think someone did something?" Carl's jaw tightened, and he looked away, guilt flickering across his face. "I don't know," he admitted. "But when I found you, Lisa, you weren't okay. I've never seen you like that." His words sent a chill through me. I wrapped my arms around myself, the weight of his concern sinking in. "I don't remember much," I confessed. "Just flashes, faces. That man." "What man?" Carl's voice sharpened, his focus narrowing in on me. "There was a man," I said slowly, piecing the fragments together. "I didn't recognize him. He kept watching me. I remember his eyes. They were dark, intense. And then my voice wavered and I shook my head. And then everything went fuzzy." Carl's expression darkened, his brows furrowing in thought. "Did he touch you?" "I don't know," I whispered, my hands trembling in my lap. The uncertainty gnawed at me, making my skin crawl. Carl leaned back, his gaze distant. "I should have kept a closer eye on things," he said, his tone filled with regret. "I let the crowd get out of hand. That's on me." I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, but the words felt hollow. Deep down, I knew we were both trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. The silence between us stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Carl stood, his movements decisive. "I'm going to find out who he was," he said. "I'll figure out what happened, Lisa. I promise." As he left, I felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. The house was too quiet after he was gone, the stillness amplifying the unease that refused to leave me. I curled up on the couch, the blanket wrapped tightly around me, and tried to lose myself in the dim glow of the TV. But the night didn't let me rest. My dreams were fragmented, filled with shadows and whispers, flashes of dark eyes and too familiar touches. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing as though I'd run a marathon. The next morning, I knew I couldn't keep hiding from the world. I needed to feel normal again, to prove to myself that I was still in control. So I got dressed, pulling on a soft sweater and jeans, and went for a walk. The crisp air bit at my cheeks, but it felt good, grounding. As I wandered the streets, my thoughts kept drifting back to that man. Who was he? What had he wanted? The questions haunted me, circling in my mind like vultures. And yet, beneath the fear, there was something else. A strange, unsettling curiosity. Strange how something can change you so deeply. Even now, weeks later, I find myself replaying those moments, wondering if I could have done something, anything differently. The pain isn't just physical anymore. It's a reminder of a night I'll never forget, no matter how much time passes. After days of trying to push it out of my mind, I finally made the decision to go to the hospital. My body was still aching, especially in ways I couldn't explain, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I was terrified of what they might find, but I knew I couldn't live with the uncertainty. The clinic was quiet, its sterile walls and faint smell of disinfectant somehow comforting and unnerving at the same time. When the nurse called my name, my heart raced as I followed her into the exam room. The doctor, a kind woman with a calm demeanor, asked me a few questions before starting the checkup. "I've been experiencing pain," I told her, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's hard to describe, but it's been there since last weekend." She nodded, her expression focused but gentle. "We'll take a look and run some tests," she said. "Just try to relax." The exam was thorough, and though I tried to stay calm, the process felt excruciatingly long. When she was finished, she sat across from me, her face serious but not alarmed. "Lisa," she began, her tone measured, "there's some significant dilation in your pelvic tissues, which likely explains the pain you've been feeling. There's also an infection present, but it's treatable." An infection. The words felt heavy, like they carried far more weight than they should. I nodded, trying to keep my composure as she continued. "I'm going to prescribe antibiotics to clear up the infection," she said. "It's important to finish the full course, even if you start feeling better before it's done. I'll also recommend some over-the-counter pain relief if the discomfort persists." She paused, her gaze meeting mine. "And Lisa, I have to stress this. Always use contraceptives. They're not just for prevention. They're for protection. Situations like this," her voice softened, "they can leave you vulnerable to infections and complications. I know this may be difficult to hear, but it's important." I nodded again, the weight of her words settling over me like a blanket I couldn't shake off. She handed me a small sheet of paper with her recommendations, but I barely looked at it. My mind was elsewhere, trapped in the memory of Carl's party and the decisions that led me here. When I left the hospital, I felt strangely numb. The cold air bit at my skin as I walked to my car, clutching the prescription like it was a lifeline. I wasn't just dealing with the infection or the pain. It was everything. The shame, the fear, the regret. Carl called me later that day. "Lisa," he said, his voice quieter than usual. I found out who it was. My breath caught. "What do you mean?" I checked the security cameras from that night. I don't know why I didn't think of it sooner, but I have the footage. His words were heavy, each one landing like a stone in my chest. "It's bad, Lisa, but I've already dealt with it. They're not coming near you, or anyone else again." I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. Knowing that Carl had handled it was enough for me. But the thought of that footage, of those moments captured forever, made my stomach churn. Weeks passed, and slowly my body began to heal. The infection cleared up after the antibiotics, and the pain faded, though the memory of it lingered. My doctor confirmed during a follow-up that everything looked normal again, but the emotional scars felt as raw as ever. Now, as I write this, I can say that I've moved forward, but I haven't forgotten. That night will always be a part of me, a lesson carved into my soul. I've promised myself never to step into a place like that again, no matter how tempting the escape might seem. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. Protect yourself. Always. Never take chances with your safety. And never ignore the little voice in your head that tells you something isn't right. I've learned my lesson the hard way. The infection may be gone, my body may feel normal again, but the experience has left a mark that time won't erase. I share this not to scare you, but to remind you of how fragile trust can be, and how important it is to look out for yourself. Carl says he deleted the footage after he confronted them. I believe him. But I can't help thinking about how close I came to losing myself completely that night. I'll carry this with me forever, but maybe, just maybe, sharing it will help someone else avoid the same fate.